The document hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. Gertrude Rourke did not flinch. She stood at the far end of the narrow room that served as Caldwell County's makeshift courthouse, her dark eyes fixed on the man who had just slammed what he claimed was the deed to the Rourke homestead in front of Judge Harlan Potts. The man's name was Cole Varden, and he wore the kind of smile that had no warmth in it anywhere, the kind of smile that was really just teeth. "That there document," Cole Varden said, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt with theatrical satisfaction, "proves that Jacob Rourke signed over the full 320 acres of the Rourke property to my employer, Mr. Silas Dunmore, on the 14th of March, 1878, which means this widow here has been living on land that does not belong to her." He let his gaze drift toward Gertrude with the particular cruelty of a man who had done this before, and has been doing so for over a year. Every person in that sweltering room turned to look at her. The room held perhaps 30 souls, the whole of what Caldwell, Texas, could muster on a Tuesday morning in June of 1879. There were ranchers, merchants, 2 washerwomen who had abandoned their tubs to follow the commotion, and in the back corner, leaning against the wall with his arms folded and his jaw tight, a man Gertrude had never seen before this week. His name was Alfred Calloway, and he had ridden into Caldwell 3 days ago with dust on his coat and something difficult written into the lines around his eyes. Gertrude did not look at Alfred Calloway right now. She looked at Cole Varden. "Are you finished?" she asked. The simplicity of the question seemed to unsettle him just for a second. He recovered quickly. "I'm finished enough, ma'am, unless you have something to say before the judge rules." "I have something to show," Gertrude said. She reached into the front of her dress, a gesture so deliberate that the room went completely silent, and she withdrew a folded piece of paper that was wrapped in a thin piece of oilskin. She crossed the room without hurrying, set it on the table in front of Judge Potts, and stepped back. "That is the original deed to the Rourke homestead," she said. "Filed with the Texas General Land Office in Austin on the 3rd of September, 1874, the year Jacob Rourke first staked the claim. You will find Jacob's signature at the bottom, and you will find that it looks nothing like the signature on Mr. Varden's document. Because the signature on Mr. Varden's document is a forgery." The room erupted. Cole Varden's smile collapsed, and in the back corner, Alfred Calloway straightened slowly away from the wall, his arms unfolding, and the expression on his face was not what anyone in that room would have predicted. It was not merely surprise. It was something deeper and more permanent, the look of a man who has just witnessed something he will never entirely stop thinking about. But to understand why any of this mattered, you have to go back 3 days. You have to go back to the moment Alfred Calloway first rode into Caldwell, Texas, and the moment Gertrude Rourke first decided he was probably trouble. She had been on the roof when he arrived. This was not unusual. Gertrude Rourke spent a significant portion of her working hours in elevated positions, because Gertrude Rourke was, among other things, the finest surveyor in Caldwell County, and possibly in the entire western half of Texas. She had learned the trade from her father, Marcus Tillman, who had worked for the United States Surveying Corps out of Missouri before heading south with a compass and a dream of open country. She had been at his side from the time she could walk, and by the time she was 15, she could run a meridian line with less than a half-degree of error over 10 miles of broken terrain. When Marcus Tillman died of a fever in the summer of 1871, Gertrude was 22 years old and entirely capable of continuing his work, which she did, surveying homestead claims across 3 counties until Jacob Rourke hired her to survey the land he intended to file on, fell in love with her over the course of 4 days working in the summer heat, and proposed to her under a mesquite tree with the particular earnest desperation of a man who knows a good thing when he sees one. She had thought hard about it. Jacob was kind. Jacob was honest. Jacob worked harder than anyone she had ever known, and he genuinely admired her mind, which was not a thing she took for granted in men of the frontier. She had said yes. They built the house together, literally. Jacob hauling timber, Gertrude calculating load-bearing ratios from the surveying manuals she kept in a trunk by the bed. They had 6 good years. Then Jacob got sick in the winter of 1877, the kind of sickness that starts in the chest and doesn't go anywhere but down, and by January of 1878 he was gone. Gertrude was 29 years old when she became a widow, and she grieved properly, fully, with the private intensity of someone who does not perform their pain. And then she got back to work. The land was hers. She knew it better than she knew anything except maybe trigonometry and the feel of a compass needle settling north. She had surveyed every corner of it herself. She had the deed, original, filed in Austin, and a copy kept in the oilskin that never left her person, which was why she was not frightened when Cole Varden rode into Caldwell the previous week with his claims and his manufactured documents. She was angry because the betrayal implicit in a forged deed was an insult to everything Jacob had built, but she was not frightened. She was on the roof of the Caldwell General Store on that Tuesday morning when Alfred Calloway rode in, because Silas Dunmore's men had been acting in ways that suggested they might try to burn her out before the hearing, and she was taking elevations of the surrounding properties so she could document everything that was hers in indisputable mathematical detail. She looked up from her surveying compass, tracked the stranger as he tied his horse at the rail outside the saloon, and decided he was probably trouble because the way he moved suggested he was accustomed to moving quickly when he had to, and because the colt at his hip was worn in a way that meant it had been drawn before. She noted him and went back to her work. She did not know yet that he was not trouble, not for her. Alfred Calloway had been riding for 11 days straight from Abilene, Kansas, where he had been employed as a deputy marshal under Seth Crane, when a letter from his old friend Tom Wellen had reached him with news about what was happening in Caldwell County. Tom ran the feed store in Caldwell and had the particular gift of noticing things that other people overlooked. And what Tom had noticed was that Silas Dunmore's land acquisition strategy had a pattern to it. He was targeting recently widowed landowners, presenting forged deeds, and either buying out their shaken confidence for pennies or watching the local judge rule in his favor when the widows had no one to stand with them. Alfred had seen this kind of operation before. He had seen it in Kansas and in Missouri and in the territories, the systematic theft of frontier land by men with money and no conscience, disguised as legal process. It was the kind of injustice that made something cold and hard settle in his chest. He was 31 years old. He had a broad, weathered face and dark brown hair that was almost black, and he stood just over 6 feet in the kind of frame that suggested the work behind it. He had been a cattleman before he was a deputy, and before that he had been a lot of things, none of them particularly comfortable. He was not a man who smiled easily, but when he did it changed his face entirely. He tied his horse and went into the saloon to get information. Tom Wellen was already there, waiting for him over a glass of water because Tom didn't drink, and they talked for an hour in low voices while Alfred learned everything Tom knew about Silas Dunmore, Cole Varden, the forged deed, and the widow Gertrude Rourke. "She's not asking for help," Tom said carefully. "I'm not offering any yet," Alfred said. "Tell me about her." Tom considered this. "She surveyed half the county herself. Land disputes, boundary lines, anything that needs precision work, she's the one people call. She's got a mind like a steel trap and a tongue that'll match it. She's not going to appreciate a stranger riding in and trying to manage her situation." "I'm not here to manage anything," Alfred said. "I'm here because what Dunmore is doing is a crime, and if she can prove her case, I want to make sure Varden doesn't interfere with the hearing." Tom looked at him. "And if she can't prove it, let's hear about the proof first." They were still talking when the door to the saloon opened and Gertrude Rourke walked in. She was not a woman who made an entrance precisely, but she had a presence that occupied space in a specific way, the way that people who are fully comfortable with themselves tend to occupy space. She was medium height, with dark auburn hair pinned back practically and a few loose pieces around her temples from working in the wind. She wore a plain cotton dress in dark blue that was practical rather than decorative, and her hands showed the evidence of her work, calloused and precise. Her eyes were the dark greenish-gray of deep water, and she took in the room in one sweep the way a surveyor takes in terrain, methodically and completely. She spotted Tom and came directly to the table. She looked at Alfred once briefly with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether to trust, and apparently the first answer was provisional at best. "Tom," she said, sitting down, "is this the man you wrote to?" "Alfred Calloway," Tom said, "former deputy out of Abilene. He's got some experience with Dunmore's operations." "I've heard of Silas Dunmore," she said to Alfred directly. "He had a similar scheme running in New Mexico territory 2 years ago. Land fraud by forged deed. I assume that's why Tom contacted you." Alfred was briefly taken aback that she knew this. "Where did you hear that?" "I read the territorial papers when I can get them," she said simply. "I like to know what's happening on the frontier. I also correspond with 2 surveyors in New Mexico who lost boundary disputes to Dunmore's methods before anyone understood what he was doing." She set her hands flat on the table. "So I know what we're dealing with. The question is whether I need you." The bluntness of it was like a bucket of cold water, and Alfred felt something that was almost amusement move through him, except that it was also something more serious. He had met a lot of frontier women. He had respected most of them because frontier life sorted out the people who couldn't handle it fairly quickly, but he had never been assessed with quite this degree of direct efficiency. "You might not," he said honestly. "If your documentation is solid enough, the judge should rule in your favor without any additional pressure." "Judge Potts," she said, "is not Silas Dunmore's judge, but he is cautious, and cautious men have been known to be persuaded by confident liars, which is what Cole Varden is." She looked at him steadily. "If you're here to be a body that makes Varden think twice about intimidation tactics before the hearing, that is of some use. If you're here to explain my own property claim to me, you can ride back to Abilene." Alfred looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm here to make sure the law operates the way it should. Nothing more." She considered this. Then she nodded once. "That I can use," she said. "It was not the beginning of warmth exactly. It was the beginning of something more interesting than warmth, which was mutual recognition." They spent that evening separately, Alfred gathering information about the local political structure and Gertrude preparing her documents and her arguments for the morning. But they ate supper at Tom Welland's table together, because Tom had insisted, and over a meal of salt pork and cornbread and boiled sweet potatoes, they began to talk in the way that intelligent people talk when they find someone else willing to engage seriously. She told him about the survey she had done that morning, and the measurements she had taken from the roof, and why establishing the precise boundaries of her property on paper before the hearing was a form of legal armor, because even if Varden's forgery failed, Dunmore might try a boundary dispute next. Alfred listened with an attention that she noticed and appreciated. Most men, in her experience, listened to women explaining technical work the way they listened to weather, with partial attention and a vague readiness to discount anything that didn't match their expectation. Alfred listened the way he would have listened to another deputy explaining a situation on the ground, with focused engagement and follow-up questions that demonstrated he had understood the previous sentence. "You measured the elevation differential between your northeast corner marker and the creek line," he said. "Why does that matter for the deed dispute?" "Because the forged deed," she said, "describes the northeast boundary as running to a rock formation that doesn't exist in the position they've described. I know because I placed those boundary markers myself in 1874, and I have my original survey notes. The discrepancy between their described boundary and the actual topography is about 40 yards, which means whoever forged the deed was working from an approximate description of the land, not from an actual survey." Alfred set down his fork. "You can prove the forgery from the topography," he said. "The signature comparison is sufficient," she said. "But yes, I have 3 independent forms of documentation: the signature analysis, the topographic discrepancy, and the Texas General Land Office filing date, which predates Dunmore's claimed purchase date by nearly 4 years. Alfred looked at her across Tom Welland's kitchen table, with the yellow lamplight catching the concentration in his face, and something shifted in him that he couldn't entirely name. It was admiration, genuine and complete. It was also something warmer, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize that even as he set it aside for the moment. "Varden's going to know he can't win this on evidence," he said. "Which means he might try to intimidate the judge," she said. "Or," Alfred said, "he might try to make the document disappear before the hearing." Her eyes sharpened. "He'd have to get into my house, or wherever you keep it." She touched the front of her dress almost imperceptibly, where the oilskin sat against her skin, and something in her face settled into a controlled alertness. "It's not in the house." He understood immediately. "Good," he said. Tom looked between them with the expression of a man who is watching something happen that he hadn't entirely anticipated, and who is finding it more interesting than he'd expected. That night, Alfred slept in the loft above Tom's feed store with his gun within easy reach, because he had a strong professional instinct that Cole Varden would not wait politely for morning. He was right. Around 2 in the morning, he heard boots on the street below and came fully awake without going through the slow stages of consciousness, a skill he had developed in years of frontier work. He was at the window in seconds, looking out. 2 men, not Varden, Varden's hired men, moving toward the Rourke property on the far end of Caldwell's Main Street, moving with the specific purposeful quiet of men who intended to do something they didn't want witnessed. Alfred had his boots on and his gun belt buckled and was out of the loft in under a minute. He came around the back of the Rourke house and stopped cold. Gertrude Rourke was already there. She was standing in the dark behind the house with a Winchester rifle leveled at the 2 men who had stopped short at the back door, and her voice when she spoke was so calm it was almost conversational. "I count 2 of you," she said. "The rifle holds 15 rounds. Do the mathematics yourself." The 2 men looked at each other. Alfred held his position in the deep shadow of the fence line, reading the scene, watching her. She had the rifle up and stable in the kind of stance that meant she knew exactly what she was doing, weight distributed, cheek against the stock, completely still. She was not trembling. She was not uncertain. She was a woman who had lived alone on the Texas frontier for a year and a half and had made the decision at some point that she would not be a victim of anyone's dark plans. One of the men started to speak, some fumbling excuse about being lost, and Gertrude said, "Your horses are tied at the far end of 3rd Street. You are not lost. You are on my property in the middle of the night. You have approximately 10 seconds to get off it." They left. Alfred stepped out of the shadow when they were gone, and Gertrude turned immediately, rifle still up, and he said quietly, "It's Calloway." She lowered the rifle. She looked at him standing there in the dark with his gun drawn and what he suspected was a somewhat stunned expression on his face. "You were here," she said, not quite a question. "I followed them from Tom's," he said. "You were already in position." She looked at him steadily. "I heard them on the street from my window. I know this town's sounds." There was a pause. The night was enormous around them, stars thick as scattered salt over the Texas sky, and the air smelled of dry grass and the particular freedom of open country. "You didn't need me," he said. "Not tonight," she agreed. "But I appreciate that you came." It was a small gift, and she gave it without sentimentality, and it meant more to him precisely because of that. He put his gun away. She lowered the rifle to her side. They stood in the darkness for a moment that was not entirely about strategy or protection. "You should sleep," he said. "Hearing is in 6 hours." "I've been sleeping with one ear open for 18 months, she said. "Another night won't hurt me." He wanted to say something else. He wasn't sure what it was. It lived somewhere behind his sternum and hadn't found its form yet, so he said nothing, just nodded, and walked back to Tom Welland's loft. He lay awake for a long time. In the morning, Caldwell County assembled itself for the hearing with the particular anticipation of a community that knew something important was happening. Silas Dunmore did not appear in person. He was represented by Cole Varden, which told you something about Dunmore's confidence level, because Varden was the sort of man Dunmore deployed when he expected easy victories. Men like Varden were intimidating and plausible and good at the specific theater of false authority. Varden arrived with 2 men behind him, and a folder of documents under his arm, and the manufactured deed that he had presented with such confidence. And the performance he gave in the first 20 minutes of the hearing was genuinely impressive if you didn't know it was a performance. He spoke about Jacob Rourke's alleged debts, about an alleged meeting in San Antonio where the deed had allegedly been signed, about Silas Dunmore's alleged generous offer to the struggling widow of a dead man. Every alleged thing was polished and specific and delivered with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed it, and Alfred, watching from the back of the room, saw 2 or 3 people in the crowd shift with something like hesitation. The hesitation of people who wonder if maybe the widow is in the wrong here, because the man presenting the case looks so certain. This was the trap. This was the dark machinery of it, the way that confident presentation creates the impression of truth, the way that volume and assurance can substitute for evidence in the minds of people who want uncomplicated answers. And then Gertrude Rourke stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She asked if she might present her documentation. Judge Potts, to his credit, said yes. What she did next was methodical and devastating. First, the deed itself. She placed her original document on the table and invited Judge Potts to compare the signature directly with the signature on Varden's document. The judge looked at both for a long moment. "The shape of the capital J is different," she said quietly, leaning over slightly and pointing with one finger. Jacob formed the tail of his capital J with a long downward stroke that curved left. This signature, she indicated Varden's document, has a stroke that curves right. I have 17 letters from Jacob written between 1874 and 1877, which I will present as a supplementary body of signature evidence, but the deed itself is conclusive. She set down the letters, one by one, neat as playing cards. The room was completely silent. She continued. Second, the topographic discrepancy. She produced a hand-drawn survey map that was, Alfred noted from across the room, of extraordinary precision, with elevations and compass bearings, and a notation system that was more detailed than any frontier survey map he had ever personally seen. The deed, Mr. Varden presents, describes the northeast boundary of the Rourke property as running to a specific rock formation that he refers to as the Standing Three. This formation does not exist at the location described. It exists approximately 40 yards south of the described position. I can demonstrate this in the field within 30 minutes, if the court requires physical verification. Varden's expression had gone through several stages during this presentation. It was currently in the phase she recognized as damage control, calculating, looking for angles. Third, she said, the Texas General Land Office filing record. She produced a document with an Austin postmark and handed it to Judge Potts. The Rourke homestead was filed and recorded on the 3rd of September, 1874. Mr. Varden's alleged deed carries a date of March 14, 1878. I submit to the court that a man cannot sell land he no longer owns, and that Jacob Rourke, who died January 22, 1878, neither sold this property nor had any reason to do so, as our accounts were solvent and the property was free of any lien. She stepped back. I'm prepared to demonstrate any of these points in greater detail at the court's request. Judge Potts looked at Cole Varden. Varden said, the widow is confused about the signing date. There was a prior agreement. And Judge Potts held up one hand with the weary authority of a man who knows when a thing is decided. The court, Judge Potts said carefully, finds the original deed as presented by Mrs. Rourke to be the controlling document. The signature discrepancy is apparent on its face, and the General Land Office record is a matter of state record that this court cannot disregard. He looked at Varden with something that might have been contempt, briefly visible before his judicial face returned. The claim presented on behalf of Mr. Dunmore is denied. The Rourke homestead remains the sole property of Mrs. Gertrude Rourke. The room erupted again, differently this time. There was applause from some corners, the startled sound of people who had expected a different outcome being relieved by this one. Cole Varden stood very still for a moment, and Alfred read his body language with the experience of someone who had watched dangerous men calculate their next moves and moved quietly along the wall toward the door. Varden turned and walked out. Alfred followed at a distance. Outside in the bright June heat, Varden said something low and cold to his two men, and they untied their horses with the particular speed of men given urgent instructions, and within 2 minutes they were riding hard south out of Caldwell. Alfred watched them go and felt the shape of what came next settle into clarity in his mind. Varden was going back to Dunmore, and Dunmore was not the kind of man who accepted the word no without exploring alternative methods. He turned back to the courthouse, where Gertrude was stepping out into the sunlight and receiving the congratulations of her neighbors with a composure that suggested she had not doubted the outcome even while she was afraid of it. Tom Welland was pumping her hand enthusiastically. The two washerwomen were beaming. Alfred came to stand near her, not quite beside her, giving her the moment she had earned. When the crowd thinned a little, she looked over at him. "Varden went south," he said. Her face changed slightly. "Dunmore's ranch is south." "I know." She looked at the empty road where the dust was still settling. The victory in her eyes was real, but so was the awareness of what came next. A man like Dunmore did not have the conscience to accept a legal defeat and walk away from it. He had too much money and too little decency, and he would consider this a temporary obstacle. "What do you think he does next?" she asked. "I think he has more patience than Varden," Alfred said. "He'll regroup. He might try to challenge the deed filing in Austin, which will take months and won't succeed. He might try to make the property unusable, harassing cattle drives, poisoning a water source, the kind of slow damage that wears people down. Or he might try something direct." She absorbed this. "How long are you planning to stay in Caldwell?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. He had intended to stay 2 days at most. He had no particular anchor in Abilene anymore. His last formal appointment as deputy had ended in March when Seth Crane retired and the new marshal wanted his own men. He was between things, which was part of why Tom's letter had reached him at the right moment. "I don't have a schedule," he said. Something in her face eased, not much, but a little. "Then I'd appreciate it if you stayed for a while," she said. "Not because I can't manage. I've managed. But because 2 sets of eyes are better than 1 and you seem to have sense." It was possibly the most pragmatic invitation to extended company he had ever received. He found himself smiling. "I have some sense," he agreed. Tom Welland, who had been standing just close enough to overhear this exchange, made a sound that he converted quickly into a cough. The days that followed had a particular texture that Alfred found himself cataloging without meaning to. The way you notice the specific quality of light in a place that becomes important to you before you understand why. He established himself properly at Tom's, paying for his keep by helping with the feed store inventory, and by making it known around Caldwell that he was there in a semi-official capacity regarding the Dunmore situation. He wasn't a deputy anymore, but he had enough of a reputation from his years in Abilene that his presence had weight. He spent time with Gertrude every day, often in the morning when she went out to survey work or in the evenings when the light went amber, and Long and Caldwell settled into the particular quiet of a working town done for the day. He learned her through her work. The first time he watched her run a survey line, he understood something about her that you couldn't get from conversation. She worked with a tripod-mounted compass and a Jacob's staff, and a chain measure and a notebook. and she moved across the terrain with the combination of physical capability and intellectual precision that was, he thought privately, one of the most impressive things he had ever watched anyone do. She took readings from 3 separate elevated positions, triangulated her measurements with a speed and accuracy that was simply extraordinary, and made annotations in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like print. At one point she was working on a hillside and the ground was uneven and she was carrying the tripod and the compass, and he offered to take the equipment and she said, "I've got it, thank you," without breaking her stride, and he had the sense not to offer again. But she did, later that same afternoon, hand him the chain end and say, "Can you hold that at the stake marker?" And he held it and became temporarily part of her process, and found this unexpectedly satisfying in a way that was hard to articulate. He was not a man who generally enjoyed being in a subordinate role, but it didn't feel like subordination. It felt like collaboration. "You said you read the territorial papers," he said, while she was taking a reading. "When I can get them," she said without looking up from the compass. "The Santa Fe paper, occasionally the Denver paper. Tom gets newspapers in with goods shipments sometimes. Old ones usually, but information keeps." "How did you know about Dunmore's New Mexico operation specifically?" She finished her reading, made her notation, and looked up. "I wrote to the Doña Ana County Surveyor's office 18 months ago when I first heard Dunmore's name mentioned in connection with a land inquiry from one of his agents. I wanted to know his pattern before he got to me." She started repositioning the tripod with the ease of long practice. "I've had 18 months to prepare for that hearing." Alfred stood with the chain in his hand and looked at her. "You knew he was coming." "I knew something was coming," she said. "Jacob had been dead 6 weeks when I noticed Dunmore's agent riding the perimeter of the property. I didn't know the specific form it would take, but I knew it would be a document dispute. It's always a document dispute with men like Dunmore. They rely on the assumption that frontier widows don't have papers." "Most don't," he said. "I know," she said. "I think about that. The women who lost their land before anyone understood what he was doing." Something moved across her face, a specific anger that had clearly been living in her for a long time. "I've been writing letters to a land rights organization in Austin. I've been documenting Dunmore's pattern in correspondence that I intend to submit to the state attorney general's office when I have enough material." Alfred was completely still. "You're building a case," he said, "not just defending your property. You're building a case against Dunmore across multiple counties." "Somebody has to," she said simply. He thought about this for the rest of the afternoon and through supper, and late in the evening when they were sitting on the steps of Tom Welland's porch watching the stars emerge one by one over the Texas plains, he said, "I have documentation from a case in Kansas. A widow named Eliza Pratt who lost her claim to a Dunmore proxy in 1877. The legal record is public. You could use it." She turned to look at him. "Do you have the case records?" "I can write to the Abilene courthouse," he said. "I know the clerk." She was quiet for a moment. The darkness was warm and full of the sound of crickets and the distant movement of cattle somewhere to the west. The lantern on the porch threw a soft circle of yellow light that made the shadow of the porch rail fall across her face in a line. "I would appreciate that very much," she said. There was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from the previous silences between them, which had been comfortable but impersonal. This one had something more tender in it, the particular tenderness that comes from being genuinely seen in the thing you care most about. It was Alfred who felt it first and looked away first, because the feeling was larger than the moment seemed to have room for, and he was careful with large feelings. Gertrude noticed him look away. She noticed it with the quiet observation of a woman who has paid attention to people her whole life and knows the specific language of someone who is managing an emotion. She felt something warm and complicated move through her in response, something she hadn't felt in a long time, not since the early years with Jacob when she had first understood what it meant to be genuinely known. She didn't pursue it. It was too new and too significant for pursuit. But she did not dismiss it either. She let it sit, the way you let a compass needle settle before you take a reading. The trouble from Silas Dunmore came 9 days after the hearing, and it came in a form that Alfred had half anticipated and half not. He had been spending his mornings riding the perimeter of the Rourke property with her, which served both the practical purpose of monitoring for interference and the less practical purpose of extending the time he spent in her company. He had stopped examining this second motivation too closely. She was teaching him to read the land the way a surveyor does, which is differently from how a cattleman reads it or a scout reads it. It is about precision and relationship between points, about the invisible geometry imposed on terrain by human measurement and legal agreement. The human definition of a boundary, she said one morning, is a fiction that we have agreed to treat as real. The creek doesn't know it's your eastern property line. The mesquite tree doesn't know it's a corner marker. We impose meaning on the physical world, and then we defend that meaning sometimes with our lives, and the thing we're actually defending is the agreement, the contract, the shared understanding. Alfred rode beside her and thought about this. And when someone violates that agreement by forging a document, they're attacking something more fundamental than a piece of land, she said. They're attacking the entire system of trust that makes ownership, and therefore livelihood and therefore survival possible at all. That's why you were so angry, he said, not a question. She looked at him sideways. Yes, she said, the land I could fight for, but the idea that someone would put a false version of Jacob's name on a document, that they would weaponize his death that way, that was the betrayal that really burned. She said it quietly and firmly, and he heard the grief in it under the anger, the grief of a woman who still loved her dead husband and would not stop simply because time had passed and the law had been satisfied. He respected it deeply. He didn't diminish it by saying anything. They rode in silence for a while, and then she said, "What about you? Where do you come from before Abilene?" He told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had poor luck and too much temper, about leaving at 16 to work cattle drives, about the years of wandering through Kansas and the territories before Seth Crane had offered him the deputy position and the first real sense of purpose he'd had in years. "Do you have family?" she asked. "A sister in St. Louis," he said. "We write occasionally. She married a schoolteacher. She's happy. Are you?" The question was direct in the way that all her questions were, without softening or hedging, just the straight line of genuine inquiry. He thought about it honestly. "I was useful in Abilene," he said. "That matters to me more than happy or unhappy. I need to be doing something that matters." She considered this. "That's not the same as being content." "No," he admitted, "it's not." Another silence that had the quality of shared understanding. They were riding back toward the property when Alfred saw the smoke. Not from the house was intact. From the eastern fence line along the creek, where the grass was dry from 2 weeks without rain and where someone had very deliberately set a fire. He spurred his horse without speaking, and she was right beside him, not behind him, matching his pace completely, and they covered the half-mile to the creek at a hard gallop. The fire was not yet large. It had started in the dry grass near the fence line and was moving toward the tree line along the creek bank, where it would find fuel and become serious. Alfred swung down and began beating at the edges of the burn line with his bedroll, and Gertrude was already at the creek bank. And what she did next happened so fast he almost missed it. She had a canvas water bag in her saddlebag, which he had noticed before and not particularly thought about, and she was filling it from the creek and applying it to the most critical edge of the fire with a precision and efficiency that was not simply practical competence. She knew exactly where to direct the water. She had assessed the wind direction and the fuel situation in seconds and was working the angle that would cut off the fire's access to the tree line rather than chasing the parts already burning, and the result was that within 10 minutes they had the fire contained. She was not out of breath. She was calculating. "There," she said, pointing to a scorched patch of ground near the fence post. "That's where they started it. You can see the oil residue on the post." Alfred looked. She was right. Someone had poured something flammable, probably coal oil, at the base of the fence post and lit it. They had done it recently, within the past hour. "This is the message," Alfred said. "Yes," she said. "This is Dunmore saying that the legal avenue is closed but his patience isn't." She looked at the scorched ground and the wet grass and the creek running innocently beside them in the afternoon heat, and Alfred looked at her profile and the controlled determination in it and felt the particular ache of caring about someone who is in danger and who is entirely capable of handling themselves but is still in danger. "Gertrude," he said. She turned. He didn't have everything he wanted to say ready yet. He had the feeling but not the architecture of the words. He said, "This is going to escalate before Dunmore accepts that it's over." "I know," she said. "I want to stay," he said. "Until it's resolved, I want to be here." Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person in her emotional expressions. But something opened in her eyes that had been carefully closed before, the way a window in a shuttered house will let in a bar of light when someone inside reaches for the latch. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because you matter," he said. "This matters. What you're doing here, the case you're building, the land you fought for, what Jacob built and what you've kept." He paused. "And because I'd like to know you better if you'd allow it." She was quiet for a long time, standing in the scorched grass by the creek in the afternoon heat, with her water bag in her hand and her hair coming loose around her temples and the specific gravity of someone who takes things seriously and does not commit to them lightly. "I'm not easy to know," she said finally. "I've noticed," he said. "I'm still interested." Something like a smile moved at the corner of her mouth, brief and genuine. "Then you can stay," she said. The weeks that followed became the most significant weeks of Alfred Calloway's life, though he would not have the full perspective on this for some time. He knew they were important. He felt it in the specific way that certain periods of time have a texture and quality that others don't, the way memory keeps returning to them even as they're happening, as if some part of the mind is already archiving them. They worked together. He helped her with the land rights documentation, writing letters to the Abilene courthouse, and making inquiries through his former connections in Kansas and Missouri. She surveyed and he assisted, learning the language of triangulation and meridian lines and chain measurements with a genuine curiosity that she noticed and appreciated. She was, he found, funny in a way that was entirely unexpected. Dry and precise and observational, with the particular humor of someone who has spent a lot of time alone and developed an internal commentary on the world that occasionally escaped in brief, perfectly timed sentences. She made him laugh twice on a Tuesday and 4 times on the following Friday, and each time was a small event. She let him into the house for the first time on the 9th day after the fire. It was to review documents, entirely practical, but the act of being in the space where she lived had an intimacy that neither of them commented on. The house was spare and clean and organized with a systematic precision that reflected her mind. The bookshelves were ordered not alphabetically but by subject, and the subjects were mathematics, cartography, natural philosophy, surveying and engineering, and then a small section of novels that she seemed slightly protective of, as if admitting to reading novels was a vulnerability she preferred to keep private. He picked up one of the novels without asking, because it was sitting on the table, and she watched him the way you watch someone handle something breakable. It was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. "Well thumbed. I thought this was a horror story," he said. "It is," she said. "It's also a story about a man who makes something extraordinary and is afraid of it. About the consequences of creation without responsibility." She paused. "I find it useful." He looked at her. "Useful how?" "As a reminder," she said, "that intelligence without conscience is just power dressed up in a laboratory coat." She said this without looking up from the documents she was organizing, entirely matter of fact. Alfred set the book down very carefully and felt something deep and irrevocable shift inside him. He had been honest with himself about the attraction from relatively early. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness, and everything to do with the coherence of her, the way she was entirely herself in every single moment. He had been honest about finding that compelling in a way that was becoming uncomfortable to ignore. But this was different. This was the moment where attraction became something more solid and serious, because he understood that what he felt for her was not about what she looked like or even about how capable she was, though both of those things were true and real. It was about the specific quality of her mind and the specific quality of her character. The fact that she read Frankenstein for its moral utility and surveyed land for the justice of it, and built legal cases against men like Dunmore, not because someone asked her to, but because she believed it was necessary. He was falling in love with her. He knew it clearly in the way you know a thing that has moved from speculation to certainty. He said nothing that evening. He was not a man who said things before they were ready, and this was not ready. He was still finding the right shape for it. Dunmore's next move came 2 weeks later, and it was more sophisticated than fire. It came in the form of a man named Gregory Holt, who arrived in Caldwell presenting himself as an agent of the Texas General Land Office in Austin, with an official-looking document claiming that there was an irregularity in the filing of the Rourke homestead deed that required investigation. Alfred spotted the problem immediately. The Texas General Land Office seal on Holt's document was slightly wrong. The interior design was off by one element, a detail you would only know if you had seen many genuine land office seals. He had. He'd filed enough documentation through them in his years of frontier legal work. He told Gertrude within an hour of Holt's arrival. She said, "I know. The commissioner's name is misspelled. His name is Hubbard, not Hubbard." Alfred stared at her. "I've been corresponding with the Austin office for 18 months, she said simply. "I know the commissioner's name. I also know that the land office does not send field agents without prior written notice to the county judge, which this man did not provide. So he's another Dunmore proxy," Alfred said. "Carrying a forged land office document," she said, and something in her voice had gone quietly, fiercely satisfied. "Which is a federal offense." Alfred looked at her. "You're not going to let this go," he said. "It's a federal offense," she repeated. They went to Judge Potts together that afternoon. Gertrude presented the discrepancies in the document: the misspelled name, the seal irregularity, the absence of the proper prior notice that land office protocol required. Judge Potts, who had clearly had enough of Silas Dunmore's operations to last him several judicial careers, issued a warrant for Gregory Holt's detention on the charge of presenting fraudulent federal documents. Alfred executed the detention, in his capacity as a former law officer with sufficient credibility for Judge Potts to designate him a temporary officer of the court, and Gregory Holt was placed in Caldwell's small jail cell to await a proper deputy out of the county seat. Holt, faced with a federal charge, talked within 2 hours. He confirmed that he was employed by Silas Dunmore. He confirmed that Dunmore had specifically directed the entire scheme against the Rourke property. He confirmed that Cole Varden had personally overseen the forging of the deed, and that Dunmore had paid for it. And he confirmed, with the particular desperation of a man trying to trade information for leniency, that Dunmore had already started a similar operation against 2 other recently widowed landowners in adjacent counties. Alfred sent a wire to the state marshal's office in Austin that same evening. He wrote the wire with Gertrude sitting beside him at the telegraph office, reviewing the language and adding precise legal terminology that made the message considerably more effective than it would have been without her. The telegraph operator, an older man named Patrick who had been in Caldwell for 20 years and had watched everything change around him, watched them work together over the telegraph form and had the expression of a man who finds the world occasionally more interesting than expected. The response from Austin came the following morning. 2 state marshals would arrive within the week. They were familiar with Dunmore's name. They would want full documentation. Gertrude said, almost to herself, "Good." Then she turned to Alfred, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked tired. Not defeated, not uncertain, just tired in the way of someone who has been holding a great deal of tension for a very long time and can feel the first possibility of release. "I need to sit down for a moment," she said. They were on the main street, the morning sun not yet high enough to be brutal, the town moving around them with its ordinary purposes. He took her to the bench outside the post office and sat beside her, and she leaned back against the wall of the building and closed her eyes briefly. He watched her. He wanted very much to take her hand. He didn't yet. "It's almost over," he said quietly. "I know," she said. Her eyes were still closed. "That's what I'm trying to feel." "How does it feel?" She opened her eyes and looked at the sky, the vast, uncompromising blue Texas sky, and said, "Like I can breathe again. Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a long time and I can see the place where I'm going to be able to set it down." He looked at her profile in the morning light, the careful structure of her face, the line of her jaw, the way the loose pieces of her hair caught the light. "Gertrude," he said. She turned to look at him. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need to say it clearly because I don't want there to be any ambiguity." She looked at him with the full attention she brought to everything that mattered, and he felt it like a physical weight, her attention, which was the most complete and honest form of attention he had ever been offered. "I love you," he said. "I want to say that clearly, before the state marshals arrive and before this situation is resolved, and before there's any possibility that you might think it was said for the wrong reasons. I love your mind and your courage and your specific way of being in the world. I am not asking you for anything. I just want you to know." The silence was long enough that he had time to feel several distinct varieties of uncertainty. Then she said, "I love you too." She said it simply, directly, in the same way she said everything. "I have known it for a while and I have been being careful about it because I didn't know if you intended to stay, and I don't do things halfway. But yes, I do." He felt it move through him like the first deep breath after a long time underwater. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the bench outside the post office in Caldwell, Texas in the summer of 1879, holding hands in the morning sun with the whole open frontier around them. Tom Welland walked past, looked at their joined hands, looked at the sky, looked at nothing in particular, and kept walking with a smile that took up most of his face. The state marshals arrived on Friday. Their names were Hobbs and Cartwright, and they were thorough and competent and deeply impressed by the documentation Gertrude set before them, which included not only the evidence from the Rourke case, but the 18 months of organized correspondence documenting Dunmore's pattern across 4 counties. Marshal Hobbs looked at the stacked files for a long moment and said to Marshal Cartwright, "This is 6 months of investigation in organized form." 18 months, Gertrude said. Both marshals looked at her. Then Hobbs said, "Mrs. Rourke, I believe the state attorney general is going to want to speak with you personally." "I was hoping for that," she said. Alfred stood at the edge of the room watching her walk the marshals through her documentation with the same systematic precision she brought to a survey line, and the pride he felt was so large and warm it was almost difficult to contain. Cole Varden was apprehended at Dunmore's ranch south of Caldwell 2 days later, along with Gregory Holt's testimony, confirming Varden's direct role in the forgery. The arrest of Cole Varden was, by Alfred's professional assessment, exactly as straightforward as it deserved to be. A man who had done considerable damage to multiple families brought to account by a combination of meticulous documentation and federal authority. Silas Dunmore was taken into federal custody in San Antonio 3 weeks after that, in a case that would eventually involve the Texas General Land Office, the state attorney general, and a formal investigation into fraudulent land dealings across 5 counties. The full legal proceeding would take more than a year, but the outcome was, as Gertrude had always believed it would be, inevitable once the pattern was fully documented. The people who had lost land to Dunmore's operations were harder to help, because some of those transactions had been legally complicated by subsequent sales or by the passage of time. Gertrude wrote letters and gave testimony and pushed the Austin office for as many reclamations as the law would support, and while not every case ended in restoration, enough did that she felt, sitting at her writing desk on a late October evening in 1879, that the weight she had been carrying was genuinely lighter. Alfred was sitting across the room from her, reading the Kansas paper that had arrived that week, and the lamp between them threw a warm and steady light. They had been living as an open, recognized couple for 3 months, by the particular social logic of a frontier community where proximity and genuine regard were understood to constitute courtship. People in Caldwell had opinions, as people in small communities always do, but the opinions were largely warm. Tom Welland had taken credit for the whole arrangement, with a satisfaction he made no effort to conceal. "There's a piece in the Kansas paper," Alfred said, "about a new surveying contract with the Pacific Railroad. They're looking for qualified surveyors in Colorado Territory." She looked up from her writing. "Are you reading that to me for a reason?" she asked. "The pay rate is exceptional," he said, "and Colorado Territory has land office reform legislation moving through that would benefit from someone who understands survey methodology." She set down her pen. "You're suggesting we go to Colorado." "I'm suggesting it's worth knowing about," he said carefully. "This is your home. I'm not trying to uproot you. I just think your particular combination of skills is rare, and the frontier is large, and there are a lot of people who need what you know." She looked at him across the room, the man who had come into her life out of necessity and become, without her planning it, the person she trusted most completely in the world. "Are you asking me to go with you?" she said, "or asking if you can go with me?" He thought about this. "The second one," he said, "definitely the second one." She picked up her pen again and looked back at her letter, and he could see the smile she was making without trying to make. "Let me finish my correspondence," she said, "and then we can talk about Colorado." They were married in December of 1879. The ceremony was simple and entirely in keeping with both of them, performed by the circuit preacher in Tom Welland's parlor with Tom and Patrick the telegraph operator and the 2 washerwomen as witnesses, and Gertrude in her best blue dress that was still practical and herself, and Alfred in a clean black coat that was the most formal thing he owned. The ring was silver, chosen by Gertrude herself from the traveling jeweler who came through Caldwell twice a year, and it fit exactly. Tom gave a toast that was so earnest and so heartfelt and so thoroughly happy that Gertrude, who was not a woman easily moved to tears in public, had to look at the ceiling for a moment and breathe carefully. Alfred noticed and took her hand under the table and held it. They honeymooned, such as it was, by spending a week at the Rourke homestead without obligation, which was the most significant luxury either of them could imagine. They cooked together, ineptly, because cooking was the one domestic skill that neither of them had developed to any particular standard, and the resulting meals were variable but companionable. They walked the property in the evenings with the last light going gold over the western flats. They talked, which they were very good at, and were quiet together, which they were equally good at. And on the 4th evening, sitting on the porch of the house that Gertrude and Jacob had built together, she said, "I want to tell you something about this house." Alfred waited. "Jacob was a good man," she said. "He was kind and honest, and he worked hard, and he loved me as well as he knew how. I want you to know that I don't diminish him by loving you, and I don't diminish what I feel for you by having loved him." She looked at the darkening sky. "The heart is bigger than people think. It doesn't have to choose between griefs and loves. It can hold all of them." Alfred was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He must have been remarkable to have been chosen by you." She looked at him. Something moved in her face, the specific depth of feeling that she generally kept private, surfacing briefly. "You are also remarkable," she said, "for knowing how to say that." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch of the house that would soon be sold or leased to make possible the next chapter, and the Texas night came down around them enormous and full of stars. They left for Colorado Territory in February of 1880. The journey was not easy. February in the high plains was cold in ways that the Texas winter had not fully prepared either of them for, and the road north and west through the territories was rough and long. But they were, as a traveling unit, extremely efficient. Gertrude navigated and Alfred drove, and they made better time than most parties because she had planned the route with surveyor precision, accounting for terrain and known water sources and the specific distances between settlements. They stopped in Santa Fe for 3 days to rest the horses and to visit one of the New Mexico surveyors Gertrude had been corresponding with, a woman named Evangelina Cruz, who had survived Dunmore's operation in Doña Ana County and who had heard about the successful case in Texas. The meeting between Evangelina and Gertrude was extraordinary to witness. Two highly capable women discovering each other across a kitchen table in New Mexico, talking about land law and measurement methodology with the specific intensity of people who have found a rare peer. Alfred sat in the corner and drank coffee and felt entirely content. Evangelina looked at him once and said, in a tone that was somewhere between observation and approval, "He's comfortable with being in the room while you're the smartest person in it." Alfred laughed, genuinely. "She usually is," he said. Gertrude made a noise that was half exasperation and half that controlled smile. They reached Denver, Colorado Territory, in early March of 1880. Denver was a city in the specific stage of energetic becoming that characterized American frontier towns in the late 19th century, loud and ambitious and sprawling, with an air of possibility that was also an air of barely contained chaos. Gertrude surveyed it from the wagon with the eyes of a professional assessing terrain. "The street grid is going to be a problem when the growth reaches the river bend," she said. "Tell the city council," Alfred said. "I might," she said. She did eventually, but that was several months later. The first order of business was the railroad surveying contract, which Gertrude secured within a week of arriving in Denver by presenting her credentials and her portfolio to the Pacific Railroad's regional surveyor general, a man named Edmund Baird, who initially looked at her with the expression of a man who has been handed something unexpected and is deciding what to do with it. She put her survey maps on his desk. He spent 20 minutes going over them in silence. Then he looked up and said, "These are among the most precise field surveys I have seen in my career, and I have been in this profession for 30 years. I learned from my father," she said, "and from experience." Edmund Baird hired her that afternoon at the top of the contract rate, and she spent the spring of 1880 surveying route options for the railroad through some of the most complex terrain in Colorado Territory, working in conditions that tested even her considerable experience, high elevations and broken ground, and weather that changed with violent speed. Alfred, in the meantime, had been contacted by the Denver Marshal's office, which had heard about his work in the Dunmore case and his years in Abilene, and offered him a position as a deputy. He took it on a provisional basis while they settled. He was good at the work. He had always been good at it. The combination of physical capability and careful judgment and genuine respect for the law as a system designed to protect people. He made arrests that needed to be made and declined to make arrests that the powerful wanted made without justification, and the latter was occasionally complicated, but always right. The city was full of people displaced by poverty and ambition, and the specific vulnerabilities of the frontier, people who had come west looking for land and found chaos, people who had lost their claims to men, not entirely unlike Silas Dunmore, people trying to navigate a legal system that was still finding its shape. Alfred saw injustice regularly and fought it regularly, with limited resources and the particular determination of someone who has chosen meaning over comfort. He told Gertrude about his cases in the evenings. She told him about her surveys. They sat across tables and walked streets and talked and talked and talked, and the happiness of it was so substantial it was almost a physical fact, a warmth in the house and in the days. In the summer of 1880, Gertrude went to Austin to give testimony in the Dunmore trial and to meet with the state attorney general's office. She was gone for 3 weeks, and Alfred, who had not been separated from her for more than 2 days since December, discovered that the city of Denver was significantly less interesting without her in it. He wrote her every 3 days. She wrote back with letters that were dense with legal observations and assessments of the Texas judicial process, and in brief sections that he read multiple times, with the direct, unadorned expressions of affection that she was capable of when writing that she was not always capable of saying aloud, not from inability, but from the particular reserve of someone who guards the most private things most carefully. She came home on a Wednesday afternoon when he was at the marshal's office, and he got home to find the house warm with a fire going and supper further along than their typical combined efforts produced, because she had apparently been cooking for an hour before he arrived. He stood in the doorway, and she turned from the stove, and they looked at each other across the kitchen for one moment that had the specific weight of time passing and being grateful for it. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her for a long time, and she let him, with her arms around him and her face against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything that needed saying. Silas Dunmore was convicted in November of 1880 on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and land theft, and sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison facility. Cole Varden received 8 years. Several of the widows and families who had lost land to Dunmore's operations received partial restitution through a court-ordered process that Gertrude had specifically requested, and the Attorney General had incorporated into the case. She heard about the verdict by telegraph while she was in the field on a survey near Cripple Creek, and the telegraph operator had to repeat it twice because the line was unclear. When she finally had it confirmed, she was standing in a field at 8,000 feet above sea level with the Rocky Mountains massive and blue around her, and the autumn sky so clear it seemed closer than sky should be. She sat down on a rock and put her face in her hands for a moment, not from distress but from the specific release of a thing long carried that is finally, fully done. She wrote to Alfred that evening. "It is over, all of it. I feel something I don't have a precise word for. Clean, perhaps. Like ground after rain. I love you with a specificity and completeness that I find it difficult to measure even with my own tools, which says more than anything I could put in clinical terms. Come home soon from whatever you are doing that requires you to be elsewhere when I have news to share." Alfred, who received this letter 2 days later at the marshal's office and read it twice at his desk before folding it carefully and putting it in his breast pocket, went home that evening with a lightness in his step that his fellow deputy MacDonald noticed and commented on. "Good letter," MacDonald said. "Best letter I ever received," Alfred said. They had been in Denver for over a year, and the city was beginning to feel like a place rather than a posting. They knew their neighbors. They knew the baker and the bookshop owner and the woman 3 streets over who kept a milk cow and whose name was Mrs. Henshaw, and who had very firm opinions about everything, which Gertrude found entertaining and Alfred found exhausting. They knew the sound of the street in the morning, and the way the mountains caught the last light in the evenings and went from blue to purple to the deep rose of sunset. In the spring of 1881, Gertrude told Alfred she was pregnant. She told him over breakfast directly with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything, but with something different in her eyes, something that was both more and less than her usual precision, a quality of newness and genuine uncertainty that he had almost never seen in her before. He looked at her across the table. "Are you all right?" he said. Not about the pregnancy, about her, about how she felt. She considered it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I'm happy. I think I'm also frightened, which is unusual for me. I'm usually much better at predicting the outcomes of things." He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her chair so they were at eye level, the way he had learned to do when she needed to be met directly rather than from a distance. "You are the most capable person I have ever known," he said, "and I will be here for every single part of this, I promise you. She looked at him with the totality of her attention. "I know you will," she said. And then, softer, "That's actually one of the things I was counting on." She continued working through the spring, modifying her field work as necessary, and completing the paperwork and cartographic work from her home office in the later months of the pregnancy. Edmund Baird, who had developed a deep professional regard for her over the past year, accommodated these adjustments without drama, which she appreciated more than she said. Their son was born in October of 1881, in the house in Denver with a midwife named Clara Fowler who was competent and kind, and Alfred was present throughout, which was not the standard practice of the time but which Gertrude had stated was non-negotiable. He held her hand and said nothing because she didn't need talking and would have found it irritating, but his presence was itself a form of language. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, and they named him Marcus after Gertrude's father. Alfred held Marcus for the first time sitting in the chair beside the bed, with the kind of careful attention of someone holding something of infinite importance, and the expression on his face was one that Gertrude committed to memory in the specific way she committed things that were permanent and worth preserving. "Hello," Alfred said to the baby, in a voice entirely unlike his usual voice, softer and slightly wondering. "I am very glad to meet you." Marcus, who was approximately 4 hours old and had opinions about the quality of his new environment, expressed these by wrinkling his face and opening his mouth. "He looks like you," Alfred said to Gertrude. "He looks like a baby," Gertrude said. "Give it a few days." But she was smiling, the full open version of her smile that he saw rarely and treasured completely. The years in Denver deepened and broadened. Alfred rose in the marshal's office, taking on increasing responsibility for coordinating law enforcement across the county, and eventually being appointed chief deputy under the new marshal, a position that used his full range of capabilities. He was good at the work and he believed in it, and it gave him the sense of purpose and meaning that he had been looking for since before he could have named it. Gertrude's surveying practice expanded beyond railroad work to include city planning consultation, which was the outcome she had predicted when she had first looked at Denver's street grid from the wagon and observed its future problems. She was brought in by the city council in 1882 to assess the expansion plans for the River District, and her report, which was detailed and mathematically precise, and also included observations about equitable land access that the council had not asked for but received anyway, was implemented in modified form, which was more than most such reports achieved. She continued her correspondence with Evangelina Cruz in Santa Fe and developed a broader network of frontier women, surveyors and teachers and lawyers and physicians, who were doing necessary work in a world that did not always acknowledge it. When she had time, which was not always, she wrote letters supporting their cases and sharing documentation that might be useful. Tom Wellen visited them in Denver in the summer of 1882, and the reunion was loud with affection, Tom sweeping little Marcus up and declaring him the finest child in Colorado territory with the partiality of a man who considers himself an unofficial uncle. He stayed for 2 weeks and complained cheerfully about city life the entire time while clearly enjoying himself enormously. He told them that the Rourke homestead had been taken on by a young couple from Ohio who were making a good go of it, which pleased Gertrude in a way she found difficult to articulate and easy to feel. "The land is being used," she said. "That's what matters." "They asked about you," Tom said. "Wanted to know who had built the house." "I told them it was a remarkable woman who knew more about land than most men ever will." Gertrude looked at him with dry affection. "That is both true and slightly more complimentary than necessary." "You'll allow me my excesses," Tom said. Alfred, watching from across the table, thought that this was one of the best evenings he could remember. In the winter of 1882, Gertrude discovered she was pregnant again. This time the uncertainty was less because the experience of the first time had given her a template, and because she was, by now, somewhat less inclined to be frightened of things she had done before. She was also 33 years old and possessed of the specific clarity that comes from having made difficult decisions and survived the consequences. Their second child was a girl born in August of 1883, and they named her Alina, a name Gertrude had loved since reading it somewhere as a child and keeping it for precisely this purpose. Alina was, from her first week of life, entirely different from her brother. Where Marcus was methodical and observant, Alina was loud and immediate and expressed every opinion she had without delay. Alfred, who had grown up with a quiet family and spent his life around men who communicated mostly through necessity, found this slightly overwhelming and entirely wonderful. "She is going to be a force," he said to Gertrude when Alina was approximately 3 weeks old and had just finished expressing her views on the subject of a delayed feeding. "Yes," Gertrude said, with a satisfaction that was clearly partly pride and partly recognition. The children grew. Marcus at 5 was a serious child who liked to follow his mother around when she was working at her drafting table and watch the process of making maps with a focused, quiet attention. Gertrude let him hold the compass and showed him the needle settling north, and explained that the earth itself had a hidden geometry that people had learned to read, and his eyes went wide with something she recognized as the specific feeling of a mind encountering a thing it was built for. Alfred watched this from the doorway one evening, his daughter asleep against his shoulder, his son leaning over his wife's drafting table as she explained triangulation with a patience and clarity that was also love, and the fullness of what he had in that moment was so large it was almost difficult to stand inside. He had been between things for so long, looking for something that had the right weight and substance. The work had given him purpose, but it had not given him this particular completeness of a life populated with people you love and who love you back in the full and specific and irreplaceable way that only the people who really know you can manage. Denver grew around them. The city changed and expanded and became less frontier and more settled, though the frontier never entirely went away. It just moved further, and the issues of land rights and legal equity that Gertrude had spent her adult life working on continued to generate cases and correspondence, and the occasional formal testimony before state bodies. In 1885, she was invited to speak at a land rights conference in Denver that brought together surveyors, lawyers, and policy advocates from across the Western territories. She stood at a podium in a meeting hall on a March afternoon and spoke about the systematic patterns of land fraud she had documented, about the specific vulnerabilities of frontier women whose property rights depended on documentation that they often couldn't access, about the ways that legal systems could be weaponized against the people they were designed to protect. Alfred sat in the audience with Marcus beside him, who was 4 and watching his mother at the podium with an expression of careful attention, and Alfred thought, this is what she was always going to do. This was always going to be the destination of all of that precision and determination and accumulated knowledge. It just needed enough time and the right opening. The speech was received with significant attention. Several of the policy advocates at the conference incorporated her documented cases into state legislation proposals that were submitted over the following 2 years. And while the full range of those proposals did not pass without modification or resistance, the fact of their existence, the presence of systematic documentation of frontier land fraud in formal legislative channels, was itself an outcome that had not existed before. She came down from the podium and Alfred was there, and she was slightly flushed from the intensity of public speaking, which was not her natural medium. She was better on paper and in direct conversation, but she had done it thoroughly and well. How was it? She asked, though she knew. Extraordinary, he said, as per usual. She made her dismissive sound, but she was clearly pleased. Marcus pulled at his mother's hand and she picked him up and he said with great seriousness, "Mama, you talked for a very long time." I had a lot to say, she told him. Papa talks for less time, Marcus observed. Papa also has less to say, Alfred said. Gertrude laughed, the full open sound of it, and the people around them turned and looked, because it was a sound that invited the room into its warmth. In 1887, they returned to Texas. Not to Caldwell, though they drove through it on the way, and the sight of the main street and Tom Welland's feed store, and the building where the makeshift courthouse had been brought everything back to both of them with a vividness that was specific and good. Tom had retired by then, handing the store to his nephew, and was living with tremendous contentment in the same house he had always occupied, reading newspapers from all over the country and feeding half the town's stray dogs. They spent 3 days with Tom, who was 83 in spirit if not in years, and who took Marcus and Alina on what he described as a comprehensive tour of Caldwell's many excellent features, of which there were perhaps 5, but he made them sound like 20, and the children were thoroughly charmed. They went to Austin because Gertrude had been contacted by the newly established Texas State Land Office, which was in the process of reforming its documentation and filing practices in the aftermath of the Dunmore case, and several similar cases that had emerged since, and which wanted her input on best practices for deed filing and verification protocols. She spent 2 weeks in Austin working with the land office, and the protocols she helped establish, requiring original signatures verified against a state registry and topographic verification for any disputed boundary, would remain in use for decades and prevent a significant number of the specific forms of fraud that had cost so many frontier families their land. She was 40 years old when she sat in the Texas State Land Office and wrote the final set of recommendations, and she felt, writing them, the complete resolution of something that had been in motion since the day Jacob died, and she had stood in the January cold and understood that she was alone and had to decide what to do next. Alfred met her outside the land office building when she came out, because he had been walking the city with the children and had brought them back to find her. Marcus was 9 and serious, and had been asking his father questions about how Texas law worked, which Alfred had been answering carefully and honestly. Alina, at 6, had been asking questions about everything in a simultaneous rapid-fire approach that had kept Alfred engaged in a state of continuous response. Gertrude came down the steps and saw her family on the street below, her husband with a child on either side of him, Marcus leaning against Alfred's arm and Alina gesticulating about something. And Alfred looking up at the moment she appeared with that specific expression that she had catalogued and returned to in the private parts of her mind more times than she could count, warm and focused and entirely for her. She came down the steps and he said, "How did it go?" "Well," she said. "Very well." Alina said, "Mama, Papa says there are buildings in this city that are over 100 years old. Can we see one?" "Yes," Gertrude said, "we can." They walked Austin in the late afternoon, the 4 of them, through the streets of the capital of a state that was no longer quite frontier, but had not yet decided what it was going to be next, with the light going golden on the limestone buildings, and the air smelling of cedar and live oak and the river somewhere to the south. Alfred took her hand as they walked, and she let it rest in his with the ease of 8 years, and a marriage that had been built on mutual respect and genuine liking and love that had grown rather than faded, the kind of love that was not diminished by familiarity but deepened by it. "What comes next?" he said quietly. Looked at the city around her, the children ahead of them chattering about something, the broad sky beginning to show the first hint of rose at the western horizon. "Marcus wants to learn proper surveying," she said. "I thought I'd start this autumn." "He's going to be good at it," Alfred said. "He has a natural geometric intuition," she agreed, "though Alina has more courage." "She has more of everything," Alfred said. Gertrude smiled. "She gets that from you." He looked at her. "She gets that from you." They walked on. The children circled back and Alina took her mother's free hand and announced something about dinner with the authority of someone who has views on the matter, and Marcus walked beside his father with the characteristic quiet of a child who is mostly listening and mostly remembering. The evening came down slowly and warmly over Austin, Texas, in the summer of 1887, and in the morning they would begin the journey back to Denver and the lives they had built there, and Alfred Calloway and Gertrude Rourke, who had come together over a forged deed and a refusal to be silenced and a deepening mutual recognition, would carry everything they had made back to the city that had become their home. But right now they were here in this particular moment, all four of them together in the golden light, and the specific quality of the happiness of it was something that Gertrude, who believed in precision and documentation, kept no formal record of. She kept it the way you keep the things that are too large for paper, fully, internally, permanently. They went home to Denver with 3 months of correspondence waiting, a house that needed the attention of people who lived in it, and a city that had changed in small ways while they were away, and welcomed them back with the particular warmth of a place that knows its people. Marcus began his first proper surveying lessons in September, sitting at his mother's drafting table with a compass in his small, serious hands, learning about the needle and the north, and the invisible geometry that underlies the visible world. Eleanor refused to be excluded from anything, declared herself equally interested in everything, and sat on the other side of the table and asked questions that were, Gertrude admitted privately to Alfred that evening, sometimes better questions than Marcus's, born of Eleanor's particular fearlessness about not knowing things. Alfred made deputy marshal in a formal permanent capacity that autumn, a position that came with more responsibility and more authority, and the specific satisfaction of a man doing exactly what he was made for in exactly the right place. In the evenings, they were together. In the specific profound way that the word together carries when it means more than proximity, when it means the complete presence of two people who have chosen each other fully and kept choosing each other through the years of it, through the hard parts and the good parts, and the long, ordinary middle where the real work and the real happiness both live. They were not finished. There was more survey work ahead and more law work and more children possibly. There would be a second son, James, born in 1889, who would inherit his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure. And there would be more letters and more testimony and more careful work toward the slow improvement of the systems that governed life on the frontier. There would be more evenings on porches watching the sky, more mornings over coffee with the papers, more long silences that were comfortable and companionable and full of the particular language of people who know each other to the depth. But what was already true, in this moment, in this house, in this city, was entirely sufficient. Gertrude Rourke had come to the Caldwell courthouse on a June morning in 1879 with an original deed and the truth and the refusal to be moved by a man who had bet against her capability, and she had won. She had won the case and the land and the justice, and she had won something she hadn't been looking for at all, which was the man in the back corner of the room who had straightened slowly away from the wall when she spoke and looked at her with the expression of someone who has just seen something he will never entirely stop thinking about. Alfred Calloway, who had ridden into Caldwell because he believed in the law and because a friend had asked him to, had found something immeasurably larger than he had come looking for, in the form of a woman with dark auburn hair and a surveyor's compass, and the precise, irrefutable original signature of her dead husband kept in oilskin against her heart. The outlaw had come with a false claim. The widow had the original signature. And everything else had followed from that, naturally, irreversibly, and with the particular precision of a line run true from a known point across open country, finding its destination with the authority of mathematics and the inevitability of love.